But why talk about this in DC? Why talk about this at the federal level? Because without major leadership from members of Congress and the federal agencies, there will not be the ability to take the steps that are necessary in order to implement policies that are grounded on adolescent development and in order to embrace this paradigm shift on where we want to go looking forward. Some of the guiding principles that will unite us as we move forward on these briefings, which are that kids are different than adults, youth can be held accountable without unnecessary confinement, youth should be treated fairly regardless of their race or ethnicity, the need for appropriate responses to nonviolent, non-criminal behavior, the critical role of family involvement, and the need to address the disproportionate number of minority youth who come into contact with the youth justice system.
Juvenile justice generally has a history of attracting attention when it's viewed as no longer being relevant or has outlived its usefulness. And I'd like to take my time this afternoon to tell you why that perspective is misguided and does a disservice both to the courts, the professionals involved in the courts, the judiciary, to the young people, their families, and their communities in conflict with the kids when they've gotten in trouble with the law. We knew that there were better ways to respond to young people in conflict with the law, better ways of holding them accountable, better ways of treating them fairly, and in the long run, you would protect public safety, better outcomes for kids, and save the taxpayers' dollars. Under Models for Change, the foundation has supported a network of government and court officials, legal advocates, educators, community leaders, and families from across the country committed to protecting kids while making communities safer and improving the effectiveness, performance, and outcomes of the juvenile justice system. What we've seen, in fact, over the last decade is a 40% reduction in youth confinement while juvenile crime has declined. We've seen changes in terms of raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction in Illinois, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. We've seen large youth prisons close in New York, Texas, Nevada, Nebraska, and Ohio. We've seen the rolling back of automatic transfer laws in Colorado, increased funding for what works in states across the country, improvements in juvenile indigent defense, better aftercare, and greater coordination between juvenile justice and child welfare.
I think it's increasingly become aware to all of us that adolescent brain research is being used and called upon when judges and legal legislatures and as well as policymakers are suggesting that we treat adolescents in a different way than we do adults, and we'll come back to this point. But I also just wanted to really begin with this crime curve, this inflection during the teenage years, when we see individuals beginning to come into the system and beginning to engage in these behaviors, some caught and some having to deal with the consequences. But when you see inflections in behaviors like this, the question we want to know is, why is this behavior happening? And how can we deal with it? And how can we hold individuals who engage in this behavior accountable? And how do we prevent them from coming back into the system again? What we see is there's one area of the brain that correlates and maps onto this particular pattern. And that's an area in the prefrontal cortex. So here you're looking down inside the brain. It's as if I pulled up a layer of it, and you can see the workings of the brain. And what I want you to note is that this activity parallels what we just saw in behavior. So this is an example. The prefrontal cortex is still continuing to develop. And it's the activity when you actually can stop yourself that's tightly coupled with your overall performance. So this is just showing that it's related to function. But this is a laboratory task. It's a laboratory task where you're simply stopping yourself to cues. But what we know with regards to many of the behaviors that teens often find themselves getting into trouble, it's associated with some sort of incentive or reward, something that's pulling them out there. So I also just want to highlight for you how the representations of these incentives and rewards are changing in the brain across this period of time in adolescence. But what else do we think about teenagers? They're also incredibly influenced by peers. And criminal acts are typically distinct from adult acts because so many more occur with accomplices and individuals their same age than with adults.
So I think it's important to appreciate that the system in some respects is young. in terms of the United States history, but it also is old in the sense that we are looking at over a century of practice. And I think that what that history can be boiled down to over time, Laurie talked about waves of reform that we've experienced with the juvenile justice system, is really one of what I would say marking boundaries, changing boundaries, and blurring boundaries. And what I mean by that is that in 1899, there was a decision made by the founders of the original juvenile court to treat kids differently. It wasn't necessarily grounded in research. We didn't know empirically the ways in which kids are different from adults in 1899 in the ways that we do today because of the research that Dr. Casey has done, that the MacArthur Foundation has funded for the last 20 years. But we do know that today. That original system was one that was protective. It was focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. It operated in secret to a large degree, which is something to keep in mind when you watch the film this afternoon. And it was intended to be benevolent. The idea was to set process aside and deal with juvenile offending in a way that was more about treatment than it was about revenge or retribution. That all changed really in the 90s. So we had a very, very long history, many decades, of, for the most part, treating kids differently. In both Roper and then in Graham in 2010, and subsequently in Miller 2 years ago, the Supreme Court decisions were completely grounded in the research that Dr. Casey just shared with you and other pieces of that research that came out of the MacArthur's Research Network on Adolescent Development. And importantly, what you saw today, which was all about the brain research and brain imaging and how that illustrates in very physical and organic ways what's going on biologically and neurologically. The truth is that the developmental scientists, like Dr. Steinberg, had already established the kinds of behaviors that Dr. Casey talked about as also being simply connected to behavioral research and discernible through behavioral research. So the kinds of characteristics that I think Christine mentioned and that Dr. Casey reiterated, this notion of susceptibility to peer pressure, immaturity of judgment and impetuosity, this capacity for change and rehabilitation, these are all characteristics of youth and distinctive characteristics of youth and adolescence that you won't see in adults that specifically drove the Supreme Court's decisions.
So this film is a film about a small town scandal that rocks a nation. That's why I did the film. I didn't care or even know about any issue whatsoever. And we stumbled upon the issue of juvenile justice and how we're destroying kids in this country, even today, even regardless of all of the progress that's been made.